I want to begin tonight by sharing a story from a book. I don't actually remember which book it was, and I don't know that I remember the story so well, but I believe it was from James Michener's The Source, which is a fictionalized account of the history of Israel over thousands and thousands of years. And there's a scene where a wealthy Jewish businessman from the States goes to Israel. And he gave a lot of money towards a kibbutz or something, and he expected that when he would get there, that they would have all of these fields, these trees planted that he paid for, and they'd have a plaque with his name on it, which I think was also in a movie as well. And they're scrambling at the last second to get it set up. But then there's one scene where this wealthy businessman, welcome Gloria, this wealthy businessman from the state is looking at a guard, an Israeli guard who's protecting him. And he starts to get deeply emotional. And one of the characters asks him and say, "What's going on? Why are you so emotional?" And he turns to the character in the story and says, "For over 2,000 years, we have been waiting to get our country back. But now we actually have, look at this guard here. He's an Israeli soldier wearing an Israeli uniform in our land. It's not just we're back in our land. We have an army now. We have our country again. We have our home back." Book said it more eloquently, but that moment in the book was so powerful. Just the symbol of an Israeli uniform shows that our country is one that not only do we have, but we can defend. And that's very key because when we sing Hatikva, the anthem of Israel, we talk about the hope, Shnot Alpayim of 2,000 years. We have been praying and dreaming for thousands of years to go back to the land of Israel, to have our country again. But the thing that we had not been able to do for thousands of years was to fight for it. And then finally, after World War I, when the British government took over the land that was known as Palestine, and a British governor, Balfour, said the Jewish people deserve a state in the land, Jews finally started coming in large numbers, especially after the rise of the Soviet Union. We had thousands of Jews, and finally they started coming together and said, "You know what? We're going to get a country now. We've been waiting for 2,000 years, praying and working, and now it's time to start fighting for it." And we did. And everyone was disagreeing, and there were multiple military groups. There was even a Jewish mafia fighting. But finally, 1948, the British government, having failed to create a peaceful country there, left. And now it was time for the Jews to finally fight after 2,000 years, more than 2,000 years, to fight for their country. And we were outgunned, outclassed on all sides. There were more of them, more of their countries, the Middle Eastern countries, and all of them. And they didn't want to just win the war. They wanted to just wipe us out, push us into the sea. But we had something more important that we were fighting for, not just for our survival, but a dream of thousands of years. And we won. We won that battle in 48. And the war wasn't over. It continued into 1967 when we got back the city, the whole city of Yerushalayim. But battle after battle that the whole world looked and said, "There's no way they can win this," and we did. So the question is, was that a miracle? Did God come in and save our people like God did from Mitzrayim, from Egypt, like God did in the story of Hanukkah, like God did in the story of Purim behind the scenes, where it wasn't an obvious miracle? Was the War of 1948 a miracle? And not only is that a powerful question for the way that we look at history, was 1948 a nes, a miracle? But also there are practical things. How do we celebrate that day? It's an incredible thing that our people not only got our country back, but that we have a country we can call home. We, all of us, in fact, right now, they're starting to open up the borders in small numbers. We can almost all of us just go right now and make Israel our home. And even if we don't live there, we can support it. We can benefit from it. We can get annoyed at it. All of those things, it's our country. Love it or hate it, is our country. But if it's a miracle, then perhaps we should be celebrating it the way we do Purim and Hanukkah. And if it's not a miracle, we can still celebrate it differently. But it gets at a very fundamental question about what miracles mean. So I'm going to take it for granted, meaning that certainly not everyone agrees, although not only personally and being part of Lake Park, that the founding of the modern state of Israel was a beautiful thing. It doesn't mean it's perfect. Nothing's perfect, but it absolutely is a blessing for the Jewish people and worth celebrating fully without question. But what we are going to explore tonight is, was it a miracle? So before I even get into the sources, which you can sort of glance at, I want to actually pause for a moment and let you all think about what is a miracle. If you were called by Oxford or Webster and said, we're writing a definition of miracle, what would you put there? So let everyone think for just a second. And if you have an idea, throw up your hand. What do you think a miracle is? And if you have no idea, maybe we'll have a better understanding by the end of the class. But again, throw up your hand if you have an idea. What do you think? And there's no right answer to this, as you'll see in 1 second. Anyone have any thoughts? What is a miracle? What is it to you? Yeah, Ken. And then Ken, I'll probably leave you unmuted for the first source. Just got to click on your side,
Yeah,
please.
I would say a miracle is something that doesn't make sense, that a scientist can't really
Explain.
explain or give you an acceptable scientific reason for.
That's interesting. So I think that the answer that most people give has a component of that. It's something which is beyond nature, but there's more to it than that, because there's plenty of things we like, in the news right now, they're talking about certain particles we don't understand. People may not say that's a miracle. It's incredible. It's amazing. I hope we understand it. But I think you're getting at one of the key things that we will see come up again. Something that is cannot be explained might be part of a miracle. Ken, don't mute yourself yet, but any other thoughts before we jump into the sources?
No, well, yeah, I was just talking with Jules today, about when she asked what we're talking about, as I mentioned, Kriyas Yam Suf, that usually
the splitting of the Sea of Reeds when the Israelites left Egypt.
My understanding is that most miracles in the Bible always can have, if you wish it, some underlying scientific reason how it worked, like for the splitting of the sea. A strong wind came up all night and blew all night, blah, 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 blah. So if you didn't believe it was that God split the Red Sea, and you don't want to give God credit for the wind, then there was a natural explanation for that. But
no, so go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so when I say, science can't explain, it's sort of beyond, the, oh, well, yeah, I don't really believe it, but if you fill a blackboard with equations in, yeah, but I mean, something that doesn't obviously make sense may be a miracle.
No, what you're saying is, and again, what we'll see in this first source here, kind of explaining some of the thoughts about miracles, I think will really help us focus our thinking. But what you just said about the splitting of the Sea of Reeds, and maybe it could be explained in nature, there's kind of 3 ways that I look at miracles that are appropriate to 1948. One is there's no such thing as miracles. And many of the Jews and the Israelis who founded the state of Israel, whether or not they believed in God, didn't necessarily believe in the supernatural things in the Torah and the miracles and everything. For them, it was a different connection. They were a Jewish people, not a religion. So one way of looking at miracles is they're just coincidences. They might say lucky, maybe not, but there's no such thing as a miracle. Just sometimes good things happen and plenty of times bad things happen. That's one. 2, which we'll see explored here, are miracles that are just no question God getting involved in nature, taking the natural order, like, fire coming from the skies and frogs and death of the firstborn, like, the 10 plagues, which scholars have tried to say maybe there's a natural explanation, but one is there's no such thing as miracles. It's just random things that look incredible. 2 is miracles are things that are clearly nature, like someone levitating, not like the guy who does illusions on TV, but like actual things that are beyond nature, and science could never explain it because science can only explain the rules of nature. This is God breaking the rules of nature. And 3, which is consistent with what you mentioned, with what Maimonides, Rambam mentions, and it will come up again in our sources, and it's the story of Purim. It's the story of Purim, which is that miracles do happen, but they happen in a natural way. God doesn't come in and have unicorns come flying out of the sea to defend the people and golems come to life. God makes sure that when the Israelis go to the battlefield, that their aim on their guns will be good, so they'll be able to defeat the enemies. Again, now I'm hinting at the Israeli war. Yeah, Tamar, please, and then Ken, I'll have you.
I just want to make a comment.
Please.
That Ben-Gurion, during the War of Independence, Ben-Gurion said, whoever doesn't believe in miracle is not a realist.
I actually, I just either read or heard that the other day in some book. I read, I think, 5 books on the history of the 48 war in the last like 3 or 4 weeks. There's so much to say about it, and we're not focusing so much on that. That's why I'm saying I'm taking it for granted that 48 was an incredible thing. And if you ask my father, Oliver Shalom, was it a miracle that, was beyond nature? He would say, of course, without question. And leading now to the first source about what are miracles, this article from a professor, a Bar Ilan professor, University in Israel, Professor Michael Avios, starts by saying that, I think he might say in the first thing, but miracles in the Bible are kind of taken for granted. Of course, there are miracles. We don't need to define what a miracle is. They just happen all the time. God is constantly doing it. So he tries to work out a definition. He mentions 2 scholars, but the second one doesn't add as much. So let's read his piece and focus on the first scholar he quotes. So Ken, please, from the first source from this article from Professor Michael Avios.
Okay. What makes something a miracle? Although commonly perceived as playing an integral part of the biblical narrative, the question of how to define a miracle was and still is a matter of debate. There is no fixed term for miracle in the Tanakh. Nes. In fact, the word, here it is. In fact, the word nes, which is a common word for miracles in later Hebrew, in the Tanakh bears the meaning of a flag, right? Or rather than a miracle. Any reader wishing to prepare a list of all the miracles in the Hebrew Bible will not be able to do so by using the concordance.
So I'll just for those who don't know, a concordance or concordencia in Hebrew is a book that basically, you can look up any word. You can look up the word shalom and it'll tell you it shows up in these books of the Torah. You look up the word nes and you'll see all the times that it shows up. And there's also digital ones, but he's saying here, like on Purim, we say al ha-nisim, and Hanukkah, on the miracles. But in the Torah, the word nes and nisim means flags, or something symbolic, like a sign that something's happening, in later Hebrew, that's how it develops. But if you wanted to type in the word miracle in the Torah and look at all the miracles, it wouldn't work. There are lots of events in the Torah, and it's not clear what's a miracle and what's just God doing stuff. So please continue.
Oh, so maybe Tamar could answer. If you wanted to find the Hebrew word for miracle, the way it's used maybe in English nowadays, besides nes, is there another word that people would use?
I mean, there's words for things that are like amazing and incredible, but no, the word for miracle is nes. And Tamar, is that correct? She's nodding her head. Good.
Okay.
And that's a really interesting thing, and that kind of confuses the situation. But he goes on.
Okay, he or she will have to first define what a miracle is, and then, according to this definition, try to locate the various miracles. Israeli scholars dealt extensively with the definition of miracles. Yara Zakovich of Hebrew University. According to Zakovich, a miracle is an extraordinary occurrence attributable to God's hand, which leaves a marked impression in the text. Such miracles may, at times, disrupt the order of creation. Recognizing that this definition contains subjective terms such as extraordinary and marked, Zakovich adds to his definition a number of control mechanisms, such as an advance announcement by a messenger of the Lord, and the extraordinary nature of the miraculous action with regard both to its duration and place, the subsequent restoration of the status quo ante, the specification of the miracle's theological objective, and 5, when a miracle encompasses only a certain well-defined group and bypasses another.
Now, not everyone agrees with Zakovich's definition, but let's say we could even get 2 or 3 of these to be true of the 1948 War of Independence, and certainly the 1967 war as well, then perhaps we could define them as miraculous. But that's essentially what rabbis have been doing since the founding of the State of Israel in the halachic conversations. And again, it's the amazing. Yeah, go ahead, Ken.
Well, I was going to say, if I quickly look at these 5, none of them would seem to have applied to the 48 victory.
So it's interesting you say that. because I would say that not necessarily all five, although you could probably interpret them as such, but I think some of them, if I'm reading three correctly, which I don't know if I am, it seems like he's saying like, they maybe the exile to Babylon, that's what a lot of miracles are, and then them being saved is a miracle, or being free and then being enslaved and then returned to the positive thing. So here we're praying to be returned to the state of Israel, our country. So we certainly got number three there. Number
okay.
five, when a miracle encompasses a specifically defined group, the Jewish people. So we definitely have five there. Number
Right, and
two, what's that?
I was just thinking, restoration of status quo ante, and so there's something that happened before, but reaching back 2,000 years, that's a big before.
Well, so
in
that's
my
the thing
mind.
is, but that's all, whenever we're exiled, whether it's the short exile under the Babylonians or this longer one, that's what we daven for. Return us to the way we were before.
We
Whether
were,
it
right,
takes
okay.
2,000 years or, a few decades, that's part of this. So I definitely think you could easily argue
Okay.
for three, for five. Number two, again, people might debate on, and that's what remember my three categories. There's only coincidences. It's only a miracle if it's supernatural, or it's a miracle if it's done within nature and you won't necessarily recognize it. The story of Purim is that. Was there really, we clearly daven al hanisim on Purim, although in the Talmud, they debate, should we be saying Hallel on Purim? Because we read the story like it's a miracle, but there was no supernatural miracles. And also it wasn't permanent. There's a lot of things the rabbis debate in the Talmud. Was Purim truly a miracle? And we don't really treat it as a miracle the way we do the Exodus from Egypt or Hanukkah with the menorah, with the Chanukiah that lasted for 8 days. That's a supernatural miracle. So the debate about whether a holiday is truly a miraculous event has existed for a long time. Purim barely made the cut. Obviously, it's a great holiday today. We read the Megillah. We have all these beautiful mitzvot, but it wasn't such an obvious miraculous event. And the rabbis, last year we did a class similar to this, and I brought all the sources throughout history about rabbis defining when it's a miracle, when you can pray Hallel. What if the Cap family has a miracle? Can you and your wife and your family, can you pray all the Psalms of Hallel once a year to remember some great miracle where one of you were saved? And the rabbis say, fine, but for the nation to have a national miracle, we have a very high threshold. And that's the question here. How high is the threshold to basically make a new holiday? That's what it comes down to. But number two here, again, Tamar, your point about Ben Gurion and my father and thousands of others is it was insane that the Israelis were able to win this war and dominate, especially in 67. It was incredible. The only way they could do it is being blessed by God. The counter is they weren't blessed by God. They just wanted it more. They were more organized. And perhaps it was a little bit of both. But I think this list, the only thing is maybe there wasn't an advanced announcement by messenger of the Lord, but you could say maybe Theodor Herzl was with the founding of Zionism. So one could argue that this specific definition of the specific professor about what a real miracle is really could be applied with a little tweaking to 1948. And what we'll see here is a lot of it obviously has to do with how you feel about Israel, where you live, et cetera, like that. Like American rabbis might be more hesitant to call 48 a miracle, but if you live in Israel and you're raised in a Zionist home, then obviously. So Rabbi Eliezer Melamed, who's a contemporary rabbi, and he has stuff on Facebook all the time. I love his writings. And we actually saw this last year. So he is a Zionist rabbi through and through. He's the head of a Hesder Yeshiva, meaning the students spend part of the time learning Torah and part serving in the Israeli military. So he's all in on Israel. So he gives a great synopsis, and we'll look at it in two parts, about what are the challenges to thinking of 1948 as a miracle. And again, you might say, well, what does it matter? It's a secular holiday, but it is kind of important because for those of us in the religious world, to think of the state of Israel as being a religious country and that God blessed and wanted the 48 war to happen, that might be important for our understanding to see God in history. So Tamar, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you would take this source number 2 from Rabbi Melamed's book, which is all online, Hebrew and English, and he starts by talking about why people wouldn't consider this an outright miracle that we would say the Hallel on, which at Lake Park, I believe we do say it. But why might people not be comfortable saying it? In other words, why would they not want it to be a formal religious holiday? So bavakasha, Tamar.
Pninei halacha. Some say that even though we should thank Hashem on Yom HaAtzmaut, we should not say Hallel with a blessing. Hallel is said with a blessing only when all of Israel experiences a miracle. And when we declare independence, only a minority of world Jewry lived in Eretz Israel.
So let's take these one by one. So the first thing is, by the way, he's not talking about the Jews who just don't want a state of Israel at all and say unless there's an outright supernatural miracle and Mashiach, we have no right to found the land. I personally reject that. Rabbi Melamed totally rejects that. So he says the debate here is really one of establishing new holidays. And part of that does have to do with, did God create a miracle for us to have this state? It's not just, oh, it's great, we have a state and we love it, but it's not part of God's plan for history. And those who say it with a blessing would say, no, this should be as much a holiday as Hanukkah. This is clearly a miracle. God wanted this to happen. So it is more important than just, who do I say a prayer or not? Is the state of Israel part of God's plan for the saving and redemption of the Jewish people? So the first challenge is saying that will only be true when all the Jewish people have a miracle and magical clouds lift us up and carry us back to the land of Israel. So he's going to respond to these in kind, but I can already say, first, just because a great miracle happens to only 10% of the Jews, it can have an effect on all of the Jews. So that's his first challenge, is the rabbis would say, oh, unless it's all of Israel, but that's, not a silly thing, but it's just such a ridiculous limitation. So number 2, please.
We should give thanks only for complete salvation, and our enemies still threaten us on all sides.
So all the Purim, Hanukkah, even Pesach, these incredible miracles of God, but right afterwards, whether we went back to sinning or enemies, we still had great battles to do. We hadn't even gone into the land of Israel after Pesach. We still have a precedent that we celebrate a miracle, even if afterward there's still challenges. I'll say that again. You can celebrate a miracle even if there are challenges afterwards. So again, this is mentioned by rabbis in different sources. And again, we saw some of them last year, but just because there are challenges that we still have to face doesn't mean it wasn't a miracle that isn't worth celebrating. Now, it's not exactly what their challenge is. Their challenge is not to say we shouldn't thank God. It's to say we shouldn't officially say Hallel with a bracha, but it's still the same idea, which is, yeah, Israel still has challenges, but it's also one of the greatest things to happen to the Jewish people. So that's the second one. So bavakasha, number 3.
The spiritual state of the country's leaders and many of its citizens diminishes our joy.
This is one that I've heard many times before, which is, look, until the prime minister is an Orthodox Jew with a long beard, we shouldn't be davening. And that's, I'm not even going to get into that, but that's a ridiculous thing to expect. The Jewish people were saved. Whether or not all of them are observant or not, that's not I guess you could say maybe that's the ultimate goal in the time of Mashiach, and everyone will recognize Hashem. But in the times of going back to Hanukkah again, plenty of Jews who were saved in the times of Hanukkah weren't so frum. And the ones who saved us had plenty of ethical issues. But again, a miracle of God is a miracle of God. And when we came out of Egypt, we had plenty of issues as a people. We were far from the people, perfect, observant people who believed and did everything Hashem. We did the sin of the golden calf, but we still celebrate Pesach, even though that happened right after. So that's also a weak argument, which Rabbi Melamed also would reject all of these. So I just agree with him. Number 4, please.
It is proper to show deference to the opinion that holds that Hallel should be said only when a revealed miracle occurs, like the miracle of the menorah, whilst the establishment of the state was a natural miracle.
So it's interesting here. Some of the points he's brought are more contemporary ones that rabbis are saying today, but some of them are based on very old sources, 5, 6, 1,000 years old. And this is something we see in Jewish law a lot, which is, we have a debate and we don't want to necessarily totally rule against another rabbi or another source. So we have a compromise view, which might be say Hallel, but don't say a blessing. And by the way, many modern Orthodox Jews take that compromise because of this huge debate. And they say when Mashiach comes and it's all perfect, we'll say a bracha. But certainly Rabbi Melamed urges to say a blessing there. But again, just because a miracle happens within nature doesn't make it not miraculous. So the miracles that, when the rabbis say, oh, it has to be a miracle of supernatural things, that limits God. What, God can only work in the world in supernatural ways? God can do anything God wants. And we should praise God for any miracles that we see. This world can be full of miracles if we'd only look for them. The last line there, we don't need to read it inside, is a technical point, which is, look, we celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut on the 5th of Iyar. That's one single day. The war for independence, I think it was something like over 9 months long. Like you can set a holiday on a single miraculous event, but this war was long and drawn out and there were ups and downs, which is true. It was a typical war. It wasn't like a one-day battle, but again, Hanukkah too. Now he points out that for Hanukkah, at least there was the single supernatural miracle of the menorah, but really Hanukkah was a process. War of Independence was a process. So you just pick a day. Even Pesach, even though it was that one night in the splitting of the sea, it really was all of the plagues and the sea and everything. It was a whole long process, but we pick one day to do it, for 8 days, I guess, in our case, 7, 8 days. So all of these things are interesting and they have a valid argument, but it's pretty easy to knock out, as I've tried to, every one of these challenges to treating the war for independence as a truly miraculous event in which God really blessed our people and saved us. And this next source here, Rita, I'm going to ask your cat to read. This next source here is Rabbi Melamed now talking about how this played out in real time. When the chief rabbinate of Israel was basically put up with that question of, what do we do? How do we make this holiday? What do we institute religiously? This is the back and forth that they went through over generations, and you can see how and why their minds changed. So Rita, please, source number 3.
Because of all or some of these concerns, the Chief Rabbinat's Council originally prescribed that one recite the Hallel without a blessing during the morning prayer of Yom HaAtzmaut. Over the course of the next 26 years, however, the state of Israel's situation improved dramatically. We were privileged to liberate Judea and Samaria in the Six-Day War, and we even came out of the Yom Kippur War with a great victory, despite the adverse conditions at the start. More than 3 million Jews already lived in the land, 5 times the number that lived there at the state inception, 1948. Therefore, on the 25th of Nisan, 5734, 1974, the Chief Rabbinat's Council assembled once again at the initiative of the Ashkenazi Chief Rabbi Shlomo Goren to discuss the issue of Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut. They decided by majority vote that a strong case can be made in favor of saying the full Hallel with a blessing on Yom HaAtzmaut morning. On this basis, our Rosh Yeshiva Harav Tzvi Yehuda HaKohen Cook instructed the Merkaz Harav.
Oh no, did Rita, is everyone else still there? Okay, I think we just lost Rita. If you come back, Rita, be good to have you. I'll just finish it. In response to this rabbi, based on this ruling of Chief Rabbinate, said full Hallel for one of the most important yeshivas, which is still a great yeshiva in Israel. And there was still a challenge in response to the claim that Hallel may be said only on a miracle that affects all of Israel. The rabbis explained that the establishment of the state constituted a salvation for all of Israel, meaning all of us. In addition, the residents of the land of Israel are considered the entirety of Israel. So maybe that's a little bit of I don't know, an ego thing like that. Like the Jewish people, it's not where you are all over the place. It's as long as Israel is saved. And the Day of Independence was specifically chosen, again, what day is it? As the day of Thanksgiving, because it was the foundation for the deliverance and salvation. And this is really important in Jewish history. We see this in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. When the Persians conquered the Babylonians and said to the Jews, Cyrus said to the Jews, you can start going back to land and rebuild the temple. When they came back, Ezra and Nehemiah, a lot of people didn't go with them. They didn't want the temple rebuilt. They were happy with the way things were. But ultimately, over time, this long process, people started to realize something special was happening. We get the second temple again. And then, of course, we got the second temple. And I think in the modern state of Israel, a lot of people at the beginning were questioning, is this really going to last? Is this just a fluke? There's always been Jews, here, and they've had good and they have ups and downs. Is this really miraculous? And I think for many, many Jews in the United States, 1967, the Six-Day War, then they saw how incredible Israel was just able to just dominate in that war. They said, Israel's here to stay. We have a country now. And it took decades for that to happen. But sometimes a miracle is not obvious right in the moment. And that's an interesting idea, is sometimes you see something and you can't appreciate it right away. You need to sit with it for a time. You don't always recognize the blessings you're given until you have some time to live with them, to recognize how they affect your life. And Israel is very similar in that way, as people didn't recognize it was a miracle. And over time they said, wait a minute, Israel, we have a homeland again. It wasn't just a fluke. It wasn't just a random battle and the Arab countries conquered them the next day. We have a country that we've been praying for over 2,000 years. And we see then that the rabbis adjust Jewish law accordingly. So sometimes, and this is a question that I'm sure was asked, we know it's asked about Hanukkah and Purim too. They didn't necessarily make Hanukkah the big holiday it was the next day. In fact, Hanukkah didn't really become a big holiday until the founding of the state of Israel. It's a very modern thing to have it be such a holiday. But the rabbis, even thousands of years ago, said, was it really a miracle? And they debated it and eventually decided, yes, it was. We can see the impact of it and how important it was as a moment in Jewish history. And that's what Israel is. But I wanted to conclude, or actually I'll pause here for a moment if there are any questions up until now. Yeah, Ken, just unmuting you.
There we go.
Yeah, go ahead.
We also, like today, we also said Hallel, half Hallel for Rosh Chodesh.
Correct.
So, I mean, it's not only that for miracles that we say Hallel. So
that is correct. I mean, there's, again, when we learned last year, there's a source in the Talmud that talks about when are the appropriate times to say Hallel, the half Hallel, the full Hallel, with a blessing, without a blessing. And, they have their rules for when you say these specific praises. But the question is, there are certain times Hallel was instituted. The rabbi set up that you say it. Can we add to that list? And obviously, we're not going to have a new Rosh Chodesh. A month is a month. You're on every month. Rosh Chodesh, we're not going to have a new idea of a month. But the other time for Hallel are great miracles when our people are saved by God. And can we expand that list? And the truth is, the rabbis debate this about all kinds of holidays, particularly in Israel, where they can establish holidays. Last week, we had Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. And there was a huge pushback from many rabbis who said, you cannot make new holidays. That book is closed. They made them in the Talmud. We can't add to it. And the response was, God still is in the world. Obviously, Yom HaShoah is remembering something sad, but Judaism is a living religion. Things happen to the Jewish people, both tragedies and great things, and holidays are our way of recognizing God's role in history, either calling on God to save us or thanking God. So if we aren't able to establish new holidays, it's almost like saying God doesn't have a role in history anymore. So Yom HaAtzmaut, not only, and I do think it was a miracle if you ask me personally, and I think it's important that it is a holiday. The question about with a bracha or not, I'm not even going to get that. That's a whole other kit and caboodle about the development of Jewish law. But Hallel absolutely should be said. And if someone says, Rabbi, can I say a bracha? My answer is, of course you can, and perhaps you should. But I'm going to conclude here. And Gloria and Leonard, I'll have you guys come in, and you can do the question and answer. So like couples doing it. This is written by one of my teachers, Rabbi Dov Linzer, who is the president and Rosh Yeshiva of YCT, my rabbinical school. And someone asked him a fascinating question. It wasn't about Hallel. It was about Al Hanisim, on the miracles that we say on Hanukkah and Purim. So Hallel has its whole other, when do you say it, et cetera, like that, do you say blessing or not? But on Purim, which was not an obvious supernatural miracle, and on Hanukkah, which did have the menorah, but still, there's challenges to whether Hanukkah we should, Hallel and everything like that. But Al Hanisim No big deal. It's in the Shmona Esra, the Amidah. Why don't we throw it in there? So Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and you can decide who wants to ask the question. It's like when you guys did your Seder, who did the 4 questions. So whoever did that can start with the question.
On Yom HaAtzmaut, the Kibbutz Hadati communities in Israel recite Al Hanasim in the Shmona Esrei.
So I'll just translate. So Yom Ha'atzmaut, obviously Israeli Independence Day. Kibbutz, there's not really kibbutz in these collective socialist farms anymore, but basically like, you know, the kibbutzim that are quasi-socialist farms who are dati, who are religious. So really like these settlers back to the land. So they're fully like hardcore Zionists, very supportive of the Israeli mission of Zionism, but they're also fully observant Jews. So that's why those 2 words are important. They're fully Zionist, but they're also fully observant. And do they recite this prayer Al Hanisim in the Amidah, you know, that we say 3 times a day and more on holidays? Please.
This would seem to be appropriate, as this prayer recognizes the miracles that were part of the salvation of the Jewish people that God had done for us in the post-biblical period, either from the threat of annihilation in exile, Purim, or the restoration of our free practice of religion and self-rule in the land of Israel, Hanukkah. Of course, we should be saying it on Yom HaAtzmaut, but this is not generally done in the Dati Leumi community. I wanted to know if I could say it in my personal Shmona Esrei, or if there is a way that my minion could recite this during the repetition of Shmona Esrei.
So a few things to point out in Tamar. I don't know if you're keyed in enough to actually add to this, the distinction between Dati Leomi and Kibbutz Hadati, but Dati Leomi, it translates to something like religious Zionists, like religious nationalists. So again, they're supportive of the state of Israel, but they're also observant. So what's the difference between that and Kibbutz Hadati? That is a little beyond my pay grade. Tamar, are you familiar with that distinction, or is that like super modern?
Usually the kibbutz dati is populated by religious Zionist Jews who are living on a kibbutz.
So it might just be the kind of like they're both Zionist groups, they're both religious groups, but one might live in an apartment and one might live on a kibbutz.
Exactly.
And the idea of a kibbutz, again, this like kind of collective farm is a very modern, or is, you know, the state of Israel was founded on that. So maybe it's just how close they are to it. So why they have different practices, that is, you'd have to ask somebody who's living in Israel, you know, right now. But that was very helpful, Tamar. Thank you. So he's saying, can I add it in my Amidah when I'm davening, just like on Purim, I add it. And not only that, when they do the repetition of the Amidah out loud, which is a formal thing, you add the Kedusha, you add the special Modim, where everyone bows and everything. Can we add it in the repetition, which is a big deal? Like on Yom Kippur, our private Amidah is pretty lengthy, but the one done out loud, the entire holiday of Yom Kippur is basically the repetition of the Amidah. So that is key for the holiday. Can we add it there? So Rabbi Linzer, as all rabbis in the Tshuvot, wrote like 8 pages, brought all the sources. It's amazing. I did not bring all of that. But Leonard, if you would I tried to boil it down to some of the key parts of his answer. And I will just emphasize one thing that not only I love about Rav Linzer, but he tried to teach us when answering people is you always balance the answer, the sources, and how you speak to people, the introduction and the, you know, trying to speak to the person basically, and then you give all the details and stuff like that. And I think he models this beautifully here. So Leonard, please.
So the question, I can't quite see where it is. Okay, answer. Let me give the answer. Let me start by saying that I identify with the religious impetus behind your question. You are searching for a way to give voice to deep religious feelings of gratitude and praise, and looking to do so as part of a traditional and halachic form of tefillah. Too often our fixed forms of prayer are said in a rote fashion. In personal, heartfelt prayer, when it happens, is expressed only in private. Personal prayers that serve no halachic role. Whenever possible, we should be looking for the opportunity to give expression to heartfelt prayer through the statutory halachic prayers, that is, to make our tefillah truly of avodah.
Shebelev, which literally means the service of the heart. It's like how we express our love for God is in formal prayer.
Service of the heart. That being said, we must make sure that any change to current practice is halachically valid and be sensitive to the general conservatism regarding changes to the text of tefillah, especially at the communal level.
So I'll just summarize this here. He's saying something so beautiful. Basically, what he's saying is, unless it's formally part of our prayers, it's not as meaningful. If you just want to say on Yom HaAtzmaut, you go out and you have a nice meal, or you have a picnic in the park, that's not as meaningful as formally instituting a new prayer and saying we can put a blessing on this day. That puts a mark on it and says we recognize that this day is a moment when God got directly involved in the history and fate of the Jewish people. That gives it so much more meaning. Again, if I go around and I say, oh, thank God I was saved from that thing, that's not the same as going into synagogue and saying the special blessing, Birkat Gomel, for God saving me. It gives it extra power. It brings God into our world, and not formalizing it kind of diminishes it in a way. Yet he also says, halacha, we don't just change it because we feel inspired about something. There is a process. And that's, again, one of the unique things about Orthodoxy, which sometimes it's sometimes good and it's sometimes bad. So the question is, what can we do? So Leonard, he continues when it comes
to saying Al HaNisim on Yom HaAtzmaut. This is a matter that was discussed and debated in the early years of the state. As you correctly note, the accepted practice in most of the Dati community is not to say it. The halacha is that one is permitted to make insertions in the Shemona Esrei for personal requests. An underutilized halacha whose goal is exactly what was discussed above, to give expression to one's personal prayers in the context of the statutory Shemona Esrei. However, this may only be done for the middle brachot, which are request-oriented, and not for the first or last three brachot in the final analysis, since it is not the accepted practice in other communities. I do not believe that one can introduce this change, barring a more communal-wide shift in practice, given the halachic hurdles identified above.
So what he's saying is just, and again, now he's getting into nitty gritty, which is just interesting. And for those of us who haven't davened in a communal setting, it's nice to remember, the formal structure of prayers, the Amidah, that private prayer. There's the first three blessings, which are praise of God, and the last three blessings, and those are always fixed. On all holidays, we always have those, but the middle set can adapt and change based on holidays. But also that's when we start asking God. We go to God, we say, God, thank you so much. I love you. And you helped my ancestors. And I'm so grateful for that. Now, please heal my community, give us wisdom, give us good weather, etc., like that. And there's actually the prayer for healing, Refa'enu. There's a line in Mos Sidrim that says, you can pray for someone. In fact, the other day, I was in line at the supermarket and a lady came over and said, excuse me. And I said, yeah. And I was like, she's getting in my personal space. But she said, next time you're at synagogue, can you pray for me? And I said, oh, of course I can. What's your name? So I inserted that in that particular line. And then there's another paragraph, Shomei Tefillah, God who hears prayers. And it's specifically known that you could pause there. There's a place in there to just add requests. If you're feeling sick, if you're feeling sad, if there's a friend who's going to a job interview, anything that's deeply important to you, it is appropriate. And we should be adding prayers there. So he says, that is the place where one would add a prayer there. However, no one has done this. No one's included the Al HaNisim there. And he's going to add a little bit more nuance there. And I just think it's fascinating to see how he tries to balance adding meaning to prayer, recognizing the urge to do this, but also our limitations. So Leonard, please continue. Nevertheless,
I believe that there is a halachically justifiable option to include Al HaNisim in the Shemona Esrei, and that would be to insert it in the Shemona Tefillah bracha. This bracha, the last of the middle brachot, is of a general nature, quote, who listens to prayer, unquote. And thus any personal request may be inserted into it. See SAOH 119, number 1. On the basis of this, one could insert Al-Hanisim in his or her personal Shemona Esrei. However, there is a problem. Al-Hanisim is a prayer of praise, not a request. As such, it would not be appropriate to insert it in the Shemona Tefillah or in any middle bracha for that matter, since the middle brachot are request brachot. The irony is that it cannot be added at the end where it belongs because it is a new insertion, and it cannot be added where insertions may be added because it is not a request.
So here's what he's saying. Here are the rules for writing the Shemona Esrei. You cannot add new paragraphs having to do with praising God. They are set. Those are the first ones, and the last one, and Al-Hanisim, would fit into those categories where it's already been permitted and accepted. The only place that you can add any new words, any new prayers in the Shemona Esrei is in Shomei Tefillah, where you make requests. Al-Hanisim is not a request. So the only place you could put Al-Hanisim, you're not allowed to put it. And the only place you can add any prayers, you can't put Al-Hanisim because it's not a request. So you're like, what do I do here? So how do I do it? So he actually has this very clever suggestion, and we don't have to read the conclusion, but his suggestion is use Al-Hanisim, but just how Al-Hanisim has a version for Hanukkah and a version for Purim, write one for Yom HaAtzmaut. And we absolutely do this. We write new prayers and then add things of request. So say, thank you, God, who saved us and helped us establish the country, and for all of the soldiers who fought, and I'll mention that in a moment, and that we have our country again after 2000. You can use the language of Hatikva, etc. And at the end, God, we pray, please continue to give us our land and establish it. You know, you easily do that. And so what he basically says is, as long as you tweak it a little bit, so it can both be praising, because it's Yom HaAtzmaut, and thank God for Israel, but also add the request so it can technically fit into that Shomei Tefillah, throw it in there. And what he actually says in the conclusion, he says, and I'm saying this to all of you, and I agree with Rav Linzer, in your private Amidah, if you, now there's not one, there might be one written actually, I'm not familiar, I didn't look for a text of it, but if you want to, in Shomei Tefillah, you know, kind of include a kind of praise for Yom HaAtzmaut, and a request that God should protect Israel and should give us safety in the land and end the conflicts that are still there, go for it. And then he goes on to say, if your community accepts it, so let's say that a shul in Israel writes a version of Al-Hanisim, and this shul agrees, and they do it according to Rav Linzer's rules, and they agree they want to do it in their outside repetition, that would be appropriate. And so in no way has he's gone everything in line with Jewish law, but he's also been clever and creative. But more importantly, he has honored and allowed us to formalize the importance of Yom HaAtzmaut. And what I want to conclude is by saying is that tonight in Israel, and we mark it here in the States for Jews that have a connection with the land, tonight marks actually Yom HaZikaron, the Day of Remembrance. And this is a day when we remember the many men and women who fought to both found and protect the state of Israel, whether they were killed in battle, injured, or survived. Regardless, we honor all of those, and not just soldiers on the battlefield, anyone, because in Israel, everyone is a part of it. When I was teaching some students and I said, who found the state of Israel? Was it the teachers? Was it the farmers? And the answer is everybody. Hakol, just kulam, everybody founded the state of Israel. So on Yom HaZikaron, we honor all of those people, remember them, but formalizing Yom HaAtzmaut in some way, certainly celebrating it, whether it's Hallel without a bracha, adding in Al-Hanisim, which I will hold with Rav Linzer is totally permitted in this unique way. All of those things are important because not only do they give meaning to the sacrifice of the many men and women who fought and continue to fight for the land of Israel, but it also allows us to continue to see God in history. And if these men and women who fought and those who did die know that they were part of God's role in history, that they were part of something that is beyond this world, beyond time, how much more meaning does it give to their memory to say, you helped bring about a miracle, whether it was a supernatural one or not, you were part of a miracle of God. And how meaningful is it to think of Yom HaZikaron as saying to these people, you were part of a miracle, you changed history. God blessed our nation because of the work that you did. God worked through you. And then to celebrate that on Yom Ha'atzmaut, it gives it a great deal of meaning. And it's important to formalize that and not just to let it pass by.